The Toronto Dominion Bank is, a high street retail bank in Canada, akin to AIB or Bank of Ireland here. Not quite, but almost 90,000 employees globally. TD in the US, I think, as I recall, is the 7th largest bank in the US. TD has more branches or stores in the US than it actually does in Canada. I work with TD Securities. So TD Securities is the broker-dealer part of TD Bank. Roughly about 4,500 employees globally, led by Bob Durrance, the CEO, who opened our office here in Molesworth Street in May of this year, and helpfully the Minister for Finance actually launched our office in mid-May. So what we do here, we've been here for about 20 years. Kind of flying under the radar, I suppose, because our clients are other banks or investment firms, or we're on the sell side. And over the course, I suppose, of 2012, 2013, that sort of time, we made the decision to downsize Dublin and move a lot of the activities out of Dublin into either London or Singapore. But right throughout that kind of downsizing period, we remained a fully regulated broker-dealer with the Central Bank of Ireland. Roll on to June 2016, and some of us, including me, were paying rather close attention to the result of our neighbours, and then looking to see from a I'm allowed to use the word Brexit probably for the first time today, post-Brexit scenario, we maintained and had an existing broker-dealer licence in the EU, and as I say, we maintained an excellent relationship with the Central Bank. So it was very interesting, again, to pick up on the comments of the Minister and Suzanne, particularly earlier. One of the key questions that I was asked very closely after June 2016 was, sell me Ireland. Because clearly the bank had alternatives in many other jurisdictions. We have existing activities in Amsterdam, for example, but also clearly one would have to consider Frankfurt and Madrid and Paris and so on. And ultimately that decision, influenced by a number of obvious factors in terms of talent and so on, and maybe we might talk about that. But the key ultimate decision was the quality of relationship that we have both with all our stakeholders here, including the Central Bank of Ireland, but also the cultural connection between Ireland and Canada. That we as a bank always covered the European names from London. We didn't cover them from the continent. So it would have been a very significant strategic change for us to locate an office on mainland EU. So from that perspective, just the connectivity, the natural connection, the communication, and dare I say the key relationships, just the existing relationships between Ireland and Canada played a vital role in making that decision for Dublin.
And of course, that's something that the Minister was hugely positive about, talking about how trade needs new champions, and Ireland and Canada, and together with the EU, can be those champions. Would you agree?
Oh, absolutely. And again, to pick up again what Suzanne earlier said, the other, not only do I agree with that, but there's an alignment of values. And I think, speaking from a financial services perspective in Ireland, again, we hope once we commence fully our activities to be the largest investment firm in Dublin. Not the largest bank, but the largest investment firm. And one of the key things in developing our business to that point is doing the right thing from a cultural perspective. There's a lot of discussion, obviously, dare I say, in the media over the last couple of weeks in terms of culture, and has the culture in banks changed? And there have been, I think, probably fair to say, unfortunate comments and discussions over the recent weeks. And I think in building that business from a TD Securities perspective, people want to know not just do we have the best price. Quite frankly, that's always a very important point. But are we going about it the right way? Do we actually empower and actually positively encourage proper diversity? What does that mean? Do we have a good culture? So even during the licensing process, because again, one of the very interesting parts of our journey was that we obviously had to refresh our license because we were changing some of our activities with the Central Bank. But interestingly, and I'll be honest, slightly unexpectedly from my perspective, but actually it makes an enormous amount of sense. A huge amount of that discussion actually revolved around what does culture mean from a TD Securities perspective, and how do we manage culture to avoid groupthink, to avoid perhaps the perception and, dare I say, maybe in some cases reality of groupthink that we had through the crisis, and that perhaps our it's not helped by the recent comments. So yeah, I think the answer is absolutely yes, but it's not just the actual pound, shillings and pence, it's also how you do business.
And I think you're referring to the SEER, the Senior Executive Accountability Regime. So this is something that the central bank has, well, I suppose a bill before the Oireachtas at the moment. And this is really to change the culture, change the accountability structure of, particularly in financial services, but this goes far beyond that. What is your understanding of what this might mean for Ireland and financial services firms in Ireland?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. So the Senior Executive Accountability Regime is, as Patrick said, is a bill before the Oireachtas, which mirrors it's very similar to the existing regime in the UK called the Senior Management Certification Regime. And essentially what the intention of the bill is to attribute personal responsibility to senior executives within financial services firms, and not just to the firm itself. So I think there's a number of examples where it's where the way you use the word misbehaviour, but certainly an assessment of the quality of management and of the discharge of people's obligations have raised a lot of concerns in Ireland over the last number of years. So the intention of the bill, which I have to say personally would be very supportive of, is to basically attribute personal responsibility for senior executives for their behaviour. One of the challenging things, I suppose, and not to be in any way negative about it, but one of the challenging things is that the existing UK regime has been executed in the context of an unwritten constitution. So it'll be a very interesting dynamic over the next couple of years, assuming that the bill passes, just to see how things like employment rights and so on interact in terms of, from a dynamic perspective, with the concept of personal responsibility. But as a matter of principle, I don't think anybody could or should disagree with the concept, because clearly, it should be part of every firm's underlying commitment to the way it operates its business, that things like accountability maps and who exactly is responsible for people's activities. Because right now, I think it's probably fair to say it's quite amorphous, it's quite ephemeral, as to that's not me, that's somebody else, or whatever. And at the end, ultimately, I think people at the C-suite in firms, in financial services firms in Ireland, should be accountable. Needless to say, how that actually happens in practice might be a little bit tricky, but I think from a principles perspective, certainly from our firm and me personally, I would be extremely supportive. But it'll be interesting, as you mentioned, Patrick, as to, does that concept extend beyond financial services? I mean, clearly, from a practical perspective, it's most obviously applicable to financial services because it is a regulated activity in the first place.
Francesca McDonough, Group CEO of Bank of Ireland, was very welcoming on this in a column quite recently. But she did have quite an interesting line, and she said she's very welcoming of it as long as it is applied on a fair, proportionate and forward-looking basis. What might an unfairly applied SEER look like?
That is an extremely good question. My favourite word of that quote is the P word, which is proportionate. I think it's probably fair to say that it's easy to make the case for the defence that this is all very complex and so on. But ultimately, I think at a very top level strategic perspective, it's easy to see what is right and wrong. Because ultimately, what's your definition of good culture? Your definition of good culture is that you do the right thing when no one's looking. In TD, our version of that is that we have a various different number of shared commitments. Treat everybody fairly. Ultimately, is what it comes down to. It's very difficult to define that, though, and that's probably where the nuance and Francesca's concerns comes from. But at the end of the day, I mean, I think the reasonable man in the clap omnibus, to use that great phrase. I think all of us know when we see something that is right, and we also see maybe more obviously when it's not. But I think the industry, and certainly my personal approach, would be. It's a partnership, where we don't expect, at the end of the day, the Central Bank of Ireland, from a financial services perspective, it has a clear role to play. It's refereeing the game. One doesn't argue with the referee generally because it doesn't tend to be successful. At the same time, whoever sets the ground rules of the game that is being played and refereed, and in this case I think it's the whole concept of personal responsibility, I think it's reasonable to have a very open and honest and fair discussion as to what that means. But I don't think people will argue against the principle. I mean, fundamentally, it's within each individual firms, and certainly at TD Securities, it is actually part of all of our individual goals and assessments as to are you doing not just the business, but you're doing it the right way. So, the devil's in the detail. I'm personally surprised that it hasn't passed yet. That it's obviously it's taking a little bit of time to pass, but it is tricky. But you know what? Sometimes certain areas, over the long term, we'll get there. And I think I share Francesca's view, which is ultimately this is the right thing. Yeah, it's a little bit nuanced as to how we get there, and sometimes it's very difficult to capture the complexity of something in a headline or in a short article. But I think she nailed it, quite frankly, in terms of the industry is very supportive.
Well, you mentioned earlier that talent and, the talent in Ireland and how great it is. And also we're in a time of nearly full employment, so attracting talent is very difficult. And on top of that, we hear that it's no longer about the paycheck, that, a younger generation of workers want culture. They want a mission-driven company, obviously along with the paycheck. But do you think that this kind of approach is actually going to help the culture of firms, which is, obviously good for the country, but is it going to be good for the firms themselves in relation to attracting talent?
No question, and I can point to specific examples of it with our own firm in Dublin, where people have said that, because quite frankly, I think most of you as employers in the room will recognise that we're all competing sometimes with each other for talent. And you're absolutely right. I mean, paying people most months and remembering to pay them most months is kind of rather important. But I think it is actually what a company and its management team stands for. As I say, tone from the top and mood in the middle is absolutely fundamentally important. And that's where, again, things like diversity and what does that mean is very important. And we've certainly had examples, and I personally have had examples of where people have chosen to work with TD Securities in Dublin, not because of the money, it helps, but actually because of the culture and the sense of the importance of conduct and doing the right thing. Now, that's not motherhood and apple pie, because, it's difficult to disagree with that, and I think most of us would say our firms are the same. But it certainly has been the case that an openness to, I suppose, respectful dialogue and treating people properly and doing the right thing is quite frankly, it's good for business. And if nothing else, you get the right people, and you then absolutely try to avoid one of the fundamental issues that we had here was groupthink. And so to avoid, and it all comes back into personal accountability. But ultimately, again, it's not just an amorphous concept. It's actually good for business. We should as a firm, and I'm sure everybody's the case, we should look like, we should talk like, we should sound like our customers and our clients. And right now it's probably fair to say in financial services we don't.
One of our final questions, you mentioned the central bank is very much the referee in the game, and we're all playing the game. In terms of new players coming into the game from outside of Ireland, and hopefully Brexit the second time and the last time I think it's going to be mentioned may attract more. In terms of the new players coming in, what's your advice to them, having been in Ireland for quite some time, about how to play the game? What did you find challenging when you went to, I suppose, reapply for and we're dealing with the central bank for a second time round in 2012, 2013, and what advice would you give people based on that?
No, that's a very interesting question. I think the key advice is to not underestimate how long it will take. But certainly our experience has been that the central bank was extremely professional. I have likened it many times to effectively like a top-to-toe medical exam, and that frequently isn't particularly fun. But again, staffed with very professional and experienced people. It is fair to say that in Ireland there isn't a particularly strong pool of capital markets regulatory expertise, but certainly the central bank, in our experience, has been extremely professional. I mean, I think the other key approach that we adopted, and again, it's part of our, dare I say, our approach to business in TD is transparency. Ultimately, you need to be, and it makes sense again as well, that you're transparent. Not everything is always wonderful all the time. Most of the time, it clearly is in TD, but occasionally you just need to be transparent. But I think you need to set realistic expectations. That the process of applying for, in our case, expanding a license is not a trivial thing. I mean, ultimately, from our perspective, we hope to have grown 16 months ago from 2 people to today to almost 50, to maybe in 6 months' time to about between 80 and 90 people, of whom 25 people will be market-making trading, front office, client facing across rates and repo and FX and bonds and so on, and debt capital markets issuance. From the central bank's perspective, knowing where they've come from and where we as a country have come from, it's not unreasonable that their standards are very high. But I suppose the key advice would be you need to invest a lot, from a resourcing perspective, to make sure that you're ready to answer the questions within 48 hours or within 5 days and all that sort of stuff, which my colleague Fola is very familiar with. It's tough. It's a tough ask. It's a tough exam. But you know what? Again, going back to my earlier comments in terms of values, maybe it ought to be.
And finally, you just mentioned the rapid scale path you're on there over the last few months. Is that set to continue? Is TD growing its presence in Ireland and here to stay for quite some time, hopefully?
Oh, absolutely. So for those of you who don't know, we have taken what I sometimes have to describe to my international colleagues unusually as the top floor, which is the 5th floor, in the number 1 Museret Street, which is the lower floor is where the Ivy is. Not true that it's the canteen, so absolutely. So we've taken a 20-year lease. We have 100 seats. As I said today, we've almost 50 people. We intend to have another 20 traders and salespeople over the next couple of months, and then onwards and upwards. And obviously, we always keep an eye to talent. One of my roles, among other things, is to see can we help the wider bank, because I say it's an enormous bank. Our part of it is very big in its own way, but the wider bank is large. I mean, as I put context on it, we hope to be in the order of about between 20 and 25 billion dollar balance sheet in Ireland over the next 18 months to 2 years. So that's a large growth to manage quickly. And again, going back to our friends at Central Bank, need to say they want to make sure that we're doing it well. So we're looking to be here in size and for the very long term.
Fantastic. And congratulations on success to date and continued success as well, Kevin. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Patrick.